today. He literally broke his leg last week, which stopped him from traveling. So I'm speaking for both of us. Also with us here is Afnan El-Gaya, who is a colleague from Edinburgh and who's also working on this project with us. I'm really glad to be speaking today because a lot of what I'm going to say is complementary to what we heard yesterday and today about this endless cycle of destruction and reconstruction in the region. And I feel one of the take-home messages from the presentation so far for me has been that this endless cycle is a strategy of governance. It's a way of keeping displaced populations in check, and it's a way of stopping them from building strong social support networks and leaving material traces. But I feel that there's also another dimension to this, which maybe we haven't touched on as much, which is the political economy side of things. Because this endless destroying and rebuilding doesn't happen in isolation. It's also embedded in global economies that come with their own processes of value conversion, where things that have seemingly no value, like rubble, are rediscovered as valuable resources. And I feel if you shift the focus from not just the destruction of the built inhabited to the people who do the rebuilding, it also brings to the fore a different type of injury, which is not the injury caused by bombs or guns, but more the injury that is done to people's bodies as workers, and in particular to the bodies of people who have to deal with the rubble afterwards and have to rebuild every single time. So what I'm going to present today comes from a collaborative project between the University of Edinburgh, Umut Kuruuzum, who's an anthropologist at the University of Vienna, and the Turkish NGO Development Workshop. What we did in spring and summer 2024 was to do field work in the earthquake-affected areas in southern Turkey. That was a bit more than a year after the devastating twin earthquakes that had killed more than 50,000 people in the border region between Turkey and Syria. And what we were interested to know was, like, A, what had happened to the rubble? Where was the rubble? Was it still there? But also B, who was dealing with the rubble? Who were the kind of people who were clearing the rubble and sorting the rubble? Now, conceptually, there are two starting points to this research. One is about the relationship between waste and capitalism. We can think of capitalism as a frontier society in the sense that capitalism is predicated on a logic of constant growth and expansion. Capitalism constantly finds new things it can commodify, new things it can sell, right? Which means that the relationship between what's inside and what's outside is constantly renegotiated. In that regard, waste is really interesting because you might think that waste is something that happens as a byproduct of capitalist production, right? It's like the cup of coffee that you chuck into the street after you bought a coffee. But actually, waste appears at various moments of capitalist production cycles, including at the very end and at the very beginning. And what's interesting to us is how often capitalist economies reincorporate waste and turn it into a valuable resource, and that then restarts circular economies. And I'll give you, this research is about one particular example, which is scrap metal, the scrap metal that you can find in earthquake rubble. Which became a boom to the recycling and reconstruction industries in southern Turkey after the earthquake. And one concept I'm really interested in is the concept of waste landing as a verb, as a process, a discursive process of describing certain people and certain landscapes as already waste or rubbish or barren, which then justifies their exploitation. So to put this more concretely, how is it that certain types of people are deemed the right kind of people to deal with asbestos-infected rubble? Why are there certain kinds of landscapes in southern Turkey where municipalities think, and the government thinks that it's okay to store asbestos-infected rubble there? How are these people and these landscapes how do they become the object of waste landing? How they are produced as already rubbish, which then justifies their continued exploitation and pollution. Let me show you what that means in practice. I'll just try to play a couple of seconds of this video. No, the video doesn't work. Okay, never mind. What you see here is, this is a short video of a 60-year-old grandmother in a border town right on the Syrian-Turkish border. When we met the lady, she was collecting scrap metal on an abandoned landfill, up to 60 kilogram a day. That was a matter of survival. Like, she lived in a small town that had been heavily affected by the earthquake. She had to take in one of her daughters and her grandchildren, and she urgently needed money. And she got this money from collecting whatever literally scraps of scrap metal were left in the ruins, and then by selling it on to local intermediaries. And what we were interested in was, why is it people like her who end up dealing with rubble? People like the elderly, women, people in rural populations, and indeed Syrian refugees and other types of migrants in Turkey. That leads me to our second conceptual axe, which is about rethinking class relationally. Anthropologists for a while have thought about class, social classes, not just in terms of categories of income or corporate employment relations, but in a broader, more relational sense, where to understand how people are positioned in a society, you also have to factor in all kinds of other things, including migration status, gender, debt, housing, etc., to fully appreciate how people are being put into unequal relations with others. And this is what this, starting from this like relational understanding of class relations, this is what our paper is about. It asks how rubble work intensifies and reorganizes existing social inequalities in the earthquake zone, which means that we approach the aftermath of the Turkey-Syria earthquake not just as a humanitarian crisis, but as a site where class relations are reproduced through uneven access to toxicity, exploitative labor, and economic opportunities. And I'll just give you two brief ethnographic moments where you get a sense of how class relations changed and were reorganized after the earthquake. But before we do this, I just wanted to give you a quick idea of how rubble travels. So this is what we, as a starting point, what we did in the research was to just map what happened to the rubble after the earthquake. And this is an infographic we produced for a report. If you're interested in seeing the whole report, it's available in English and Turkish on our website. But if you just go to up there to number 1 and then you follow me around, what you can see is that when the earthquake happened, it heavily affected cities in southern Turkey. The amount of rubble created by the 2023 earthquakes was far superior to, for example, the amount of rubble in the Japan earthquake more than 10 years earlier. What that meant was that Turkish authorities had to clear the rubble quickly to even start thinking about reconstruction. How that worked in practice was that the government made a deal with subcontracted companies to take the rubble outside of cities, take it into rural areas, and in return, companies were allowed to harvest the rubble and to take out what was most valuable. At the time of our fieldwork, a year after the earthquake, that was still scrap metal. What you need to know for this as well is the region that was affected by the earthquake is also a global hub for scrap metal recycling. So in a way, for a lot of industries in the region, the earthquake was fortunate because it produced a resource, scrap metal, that these economies desperately wanted. So companies transported the earthquake rubble outside of cities. That happened in the first month after the earthquake. And then they were at number 4 now, they paid workers to go through the rubble by hand and with heavy machinery, and I'll come to this in a second. This happened, this phase of like harvesting the rubble, extracting the scrap metal was just coming to an end in spring 2024 when we were visiting the field. So imagine these giant landfills of like earthquake rubble dumped into rural areas, including into natural reserves, where workers had been sifting through these, taking out anything that was valuable. In many cases, such as in the case of this old lady whose picture I just showed you, what happens afterwards was that once the companies left, municipalities just opened up the landfills and then local people descended on them and then also by hand tried to dig out whatever was still valuable. As for the companies, what they did with the scrap metal was that they put it on lorries and then they took it back to the coast. They took it back to the cities where the scrap metal recycling factories are, where the steel mills are. And then the scrap metal was remolded into iron bars, used for new construction, for reconstruction buildings. At the time of our fieldwork, there was massive reconstruction going on all over the affected earthquake sites. Along this cycle, the scrap metal changed hands and owners many times. There were multiple intermediaries and companies involved, so that if you go back to step 4, the people who actually manually with their hands extracted the scrap metal, there was no trace of them left, even a couple of steps further along the line. So these people did all the hard work, labor, but by the time the scrap metal had traveled to the steel mills, it was completely unclear who had done the sorting. This, of course, is deliberate. Now let me begin. This is one of 2 pictures I would like to show you. This is a picture that comes from one of these landfills. This is in a small town called Belen, which is in the Nur Mountains above a city called Iskenderun, which sustained quite bad damage during the earthquake. And the rubble you can see here comes from Iskenderun, had been transported up the mountains and literally been dumped in this bucolic, beautiful mountain town. What you see in the picture is actually 2 types of labor. What you see in the front is a giant, this is what a heap of scrap metal looks like. This had been compiled by hand, by Syrian workers. In the back you see the diggers. Diggers were operated by Turkish workers. So there is a first, coming back to how class relations are reorganized after a disaster. Here's a first fault line. The fault line is along citizenship lines. The Turkish workers who operated the diggers had fixed, had contracts and social securities with these companies. They had fixed salaries of 55,000 Turkish lira a month, and they also received free accommodation and food from the company. So it was a proper employment relationship. The Syrian workers who went through the scrap metal by hand did have no such formal employment relationship. They were informal day laborers who were paid 1,000 Turkish lira for each day of work, but had to pay for their own food and accommodation, and there was no social security and nothing in writing. This is maybe what you would expect. The people with the insecure citizenship status, with the insecure migration status, are the ones who are the informal workers on the same site, all working alongside each other. But to make this even more complex is that these relationships were also charged with other patriarchal and kinship overtones. And in fact, if you want to understand how these relationships, these class relations unfold between the Turkish and the Syrian guys in this workplace, the person who epitomizes these ambivalences is the labor intermediary, the person who recruits the informal workers. There's a Syrian term for that, that is shawish, which for Syrians, I know that in Jordan you use the term differently, but for Syrians a shawish is often an agricultural labor intermediary who would kind of recruit huge groups of workers and take them to agricultural work sites, often from his extended kinship networks. What's interesting is that when we went there in April 2024, I went with my Turkish colleagues who interviewed the Turkish workers and the Turkish overseer of the site. And then I asked the young Syrian guys who were also working there, how did you come to work here? Who recruited you? And then one of the young guys pointed at the Turkish overseer, who was of course a company employee at the site, and was like, oh, this guy is the shawish, this guy recruited me. And it was very interesting that by using this term of shawish, he introduced this entire cultural baggage of patriarchal and kinship and debt relationships. The reason I'm pointing this out is that this is a microcosm of complicated class relationships, where formal company relationships and companies speak about security standards and safety, and global economies coexist with informal working relationships and also these other kinship and patriarchal expectations, all in the same workplace. And it's in these ambivalences that the subtle class hierarchies emerge between the different types of workers that you find on this site. Now let me show you one other example. One aspect of seeing class relationally is that you see how people who fall in different categories relate to each other. And one thing that I found really interesting is that not only is this a cycle of destruction, reconstruction, but workers also cycle through these economies and cycle through different types of economies. So for example, people who worked in agriculture before the earthquake briefly worked in reconstruction or rubble removal afterwards, then returned to agriculture and so on. And it's almost like a game of musical chairs where different type of like informal people, of informal workers from different marginalized categories compete for these jobs, where you have the Syrian workers, poor Turkish workers, the elderly, all the women, all of them competing for these jobs. What that means for the companies is that A, it's good news, there's always enough workers, usually. It means that sometimes to deal with these fluctuations, they might have to briefly adjust salaries. But that means that this is not a stable situation. It's a situation in flux, where you have different types of people entering and exiting these informal economies. And if you want to understand how these dynamics unfold, again, the best people to ask are the labor intermediaries, because they are the guys who do the recruiting, and they are the ones who, from the top of their head, can tell you exactly what the current day rate is for a day laborer and where they find their day laborers. So this is something else we did in this project. We spoke to different labor intermediaries, both Turkish and Syrian and southern Turkey, who recruited people both in agriculture and in rubble removal. And what we found was that immediately after the earthquake, a lot of Syrian refugees left the area because there was a shortage of housing, and if you didn't have family support networks in the area, it was very hard to secure housing. So a lot of Syrians left and were replaced by Turkish workers, and particularly retired old Turkish workers. There was also for some time a competition going on between agriculture and rubble removal and reconstruction, because rubble removal and reconstruction paid better. But at the time of our research, a year later, a lot of Syrians had returned to working in agriculture. And this is what I want to show you here. This is, the people you see here are all Syrians. This is like outside a small town called, or an agricultural town called Islahiye in the Gaziantep district, which is famous for pepper production. It's where the famous Turkish dried pepper powder comes from. And this was in April 2024, at the beginning of the pepper season. Most of these people are under 18, they're kids. It's really hard work. This is hard, like really hard agricultural day labor. That was organized, of course, by a shawish, by an intermediary. And this person told us that indeed a lot of the Syrians in the area had worked in rubble removal in Islahiye, which had sustained terrible damage, had lost a lot of people, including an entire girls' school during the earthquake. But also the Syrians had been given the most dangerous jobs, and a lot of Syrians had died because they were usually sent to the higher floors of buildings that were to be dismantled. So when the buildings crashed, it was the Syrian refugees who were trapped in them, which meant that by the time of our fieldwork, a lot of Syrians had returned to agriculture, including these kids. And that to us was really interesting, because it made you understand how there was clearly a lot of moving in and out of this work on, and workers could decide to quit these jobs in rubble removal, but they didn't necessarily end up with better jobs, like the other available jobs with this. And I found this particularly striking, because working with asbestos-infected rubble is obviously highly toxic. There are long-term health consequences which are badly understood. People were not wearing any protective gear. But if you work with this pepper and with pepper paste, it's also toxic, because it contains, especially if you then throughout the summer also work in de-stemming and drying pepper, if you do work in the entire production cycle over the year, because it burns your skin to the point where the people who work with pepper over the summer have black lesions and their entire hands are burned and bleeding. So see how people went back from working with one type of toxic material to another type of material, where this, you could say this is agriculture, but in reality, here they were exposed not only to pesticides, but also to pepper, which, when it's treated, becomes a toxic plant. So to wrap this up, the point we've been trying to make is that this post-earthquake rubble economy that emerged in Turkey after 2023 wasn't simply a technical process. That wasn't just about finding the best technical solution to rubble removal and reconstruction. Rather, it became a class field of extraction in which destruction itself generated new forms of value through the labor of already marginalized populations who were then put to compete with each other. That means that rubble sites functioned as waste frontiers where discarded materials, discarded spaces, and discarded bodies were reincorporated into new cycles of accumulations. And here you see how the cycle of construction and reconstruction and destruction just starts again. Thank you.